Morning children, I am going to teach history for the 9th standard, and I am taking a short, let us do a recap of what we did last time. So, last time we came down and we did some, we went and we did some superior technological and complex economic relationships, and what were the examples. I gave you the 6 examples. I gave you Bronze Age civilization we did. Then we moved on further. We moved on further to the Harappan civilization, and we discussed the Great Bath, the citadel, and the seals. We also did the bearded man and the dancing girl, the dockyards, and also the last one was the script. Further on, we moved on back again to the origin of the civilization. We did the origin of the civilization, and the origin of the civilization had 2 major points. One was foreign origin and the second one was an indigenous origin. I had discussed both the foreign and the indigenous origin to you. We then went, now the thing is, we went on to the extent of the civilization. How far did the civilization go and what was its extent? We completed that. Now I am moving, now I am moving on to urban planning. Urban planning. So, this is a very complex kind of a situation, because the Harappan and the Mohenjo-daro both had different plannings. So, the urban planning of the cities. So, Harappan city had 2 most important Harappan cities, that is in Harappa, in Montgomery. Now, Montgomery district of Punjab, today Montgomery district of Punjab is in Pakistan. So, previously of course it was in India, but after the partition it moved on to Pakistan. We did Mohenjo-daro, which is in Larkan and district of Sindh. Both are now in Pakistan. These 2 cities are linked by the river Indus. The river Indus plays a very, very important role, and because the river Indus, both these cities are linked by the river Indus, it is called the Indus Valley civilization. So, the Harappan and the Mohenjo-daro civilization is also known as the Indus Valley civilization. These 2 cities are linked by the river Indus, and hence it is called the Indus Valley civilization. A third city, Chanundoro, it is about 130 kilometers south of Mohenjo-daro, and then there is the 4th city which was dug up by the archaeologist in Gujarat, that is at Lothal. This Lothal city was a huge, very huge city. It had granary, it had dockyard, it had the citadel. So, it was one of the biggest cities that were dug up by the archaeological department in Lothal, Gujarat. So, this city was very famous, this Harappan city was very famous, because during that age, in that BC, the river ran right into the Gulf Stream, that is the Gulf of Cambay. The Gulf of Cambay, it ran into the Gulf of Cambay. But today, present day, if you go to Lothal, it is all barren. There is no river, there is no Gulf Stream, there is no connection, nothing. So, you can see that how the tides have changed it, the river has changed its course, and the sea also has changed its course. And now, the Gulf Stream of Cambay has gone right up far away. It is gone up practically to the near the run of Kutch. So, this city now is just a small village, and it is totally surrounded by land on all 4 sides. There is no water, nothing. But during the Harappan time, this was the main city that had the biggest dockyard. They had the biggest dockyard. They found seals from the Mesopotamian, from the Syrian, and from all over. So, that tells us that these people traded. They did trade with other countries. So, here Lothal was the 4th city that was founded. This city was at the head of the Gulf of Cambay. The fifth city was Kalibanga. Now, Kalibanga also is another very, very important city because it was in northern Rajasthan. It was in Rajasthan and it was over there, and at that time you can imagine part of Rajasthan was not a desert. Where Kalibanga was, that part of Rajasthan was not a desert at all. It so happened that that part of Rajasthan was totally not a desert, and they did have a river which connected out into the sea. But today Kalibanga is totally in the desert area, and part of Kalibanga has gone on to Pakistan. So this is what has happened over the years. You can see how the templates of the earth's crust has moved and how the land formation has changed. The Harappan culture has been found. It is mature and flourishing stage. It was found in its mature and flourishing stage. This stage not only tells us about the 6 cities, but it also tells us about the cities of Suttukendor. It tells us about the cities of Suttukendor and each of these which has a citadel. The later Harappan phase has also been discovered in Rangpur, in Kathiawar, in Gujarat. So these are the ones that have been later on discovered. We have certain features of the urban planning. Urban planning was a great advancement in that BC for the Harappans. You can imagine that technologically they were savvy, and they knew about bitumen, they knew about gypsum, they knew about baking bricks, and they were the first ones to build the Great Bath. So technologically they were very good. They also found out about agriculture, which increased their produce, and they were very keen on having a proper system of administration. So this urbanization and the urban planning, so we cannot say that Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were a rural settlement. No, they weren't rural, they were urban. They were an urban settlement because they did capture some things from the Mesopotamian people who came for trade and from the Syrian people who came for trade. The main trading people they traded was with Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia today is what we call Iran, Iraq. They were the closest. So they traded with Mesopotamia. In those days, Mesopotamia was known as Iraq, Iran was known as Mesopotamia. So the most striking feature of the Harappan civilization was its urban planning. This urban planning in the industries, in the Indus cities, they differed. They differed a lot from the Sumerian. The Sumerian planning was totally different. The Sumerian planning, the cities and the Mesopotamian civilization, they planned their cities in a very different way, and also did the Harappans. But the Harappan civilization took a bit of the Mesopotamian and the Sumerian planning system. But in modern Iraq, the Sumerian cities were developed around the temple. So in now present modern day Iraq, which was known as Mesopotamia in that time, their cities were totally concentrated around the temple. So they had the temple in the center, and around the temple they developed their cities. That was in the Mesopotamian. Even in the Sumerian people, the Sumerian people also, they followed the same culture. They had this temple in the middle, and around it all their tiny civilizations grew. And this also, urban civilization, had a very unique kind of a distinct way. It also showed us the level of the different categories of their status. So it tells us about the higher status, the second status, and the third status. So it tells us about the high priest and the very knowledgeable people who lived on top. Then came the other people like the artisans and the craftsmen and the administrative people. And then outside the city walls was all the people who did work, like the peasants and the poor people and the minority people, you could call them. So, this indicated by the regularity of the divisions. So, they were divided also into 3 divisions. The same way Harappan and Mohenjo-daro also was divided into 2 divisions, not 3. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro was basically divided into 2 divisions. So, this division was caused because you can tell about the citadel. As I earlier told you all, the citadel was one of the main parts. The citadel, on the higher structure, it had the great bath that was used as a ritual by the high priest and the people, and some kind of rituals used to take place. Then around the citadel they had their workshops, they had the granary, they had the town hall, and then below that they had a wall which divided them from the other people, and then going out further were the poor people, the peasants, the artisans, and all the other people who worked for the people who lived in the citadel. There were many people who worked in the citadel from the lower region. Peasants mostly were used in the farmlands at that time, because farming was the greatest occupation, and this farming occupation gave them a lot of produce. Now, the produce that they used among themselves and the produce that they exported, they had a lot of produce which was left over. The leftover produce they started exporting, and that led to trade. And when they started exporting the produce, this produce gave them more time. The surplus produce was exported, and this surplus gave them a lot of time. They had a lot of time on their hands to do other things, like to become artisans, to choose a kind of vocation or a hobby that they each one liked. So, this was the thing. The main characteristics of the town planning were but there were about 5 or 6 main characteristics. So, I will take you through each one of them. So, the first characteristic was that each town was divided into 2 parts. As I earlier said, they did not have 3 like the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians. They had only 2 parts. So, it was called the raised area. They had a platform built, and on the platform they built a raised area. The raised area was called the citadel. It was known as the citadel, and the lower area was known as the lower town. It was known as the lower town. The citadel owed its height to the buildings, which were constructed on a mud platform with baked bricks. So, this citadel was separated from the lower town by a huge wall which was built right around it. So, people could not enter in unless you were given permission to enter into the citadel. So, it was closely guarded. The next one is that in the citadel they had important buildings, like I told you earlier on. The great bath was situated, the granary was situated, they had an assembly hall, and they had workshops which were located on the citadel. The lower town had the residential buildings where people lived and they worked. So, the lower town was basically residential buildings. The second point was the main streets. The main streets of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they were formed in a kind of a grid. They followed a grid pattern which was running from north to south and from east to west. So, they had this grid pattern, and that made it a very well planned city. If you look at today's city, Chandigarh has also followed a part of that kind of a city. They also have followed a grid pattern, but in Chandigarh, of course, they have numbers. It is units, they are called in units, but here they had a grid pattern which was running from north to south. The houses at the streets in the corner, see the people how advanced they were at that time. During that age, that is in that BC, the houses were so well developed that they knew that they would face difficulties when they wanted to transport goods, at the time of transporting goods. So, you can imagine in 250 BC, at that time people used, they developed this houses by making the corners of the houses rounded, They didn't have sharp edges. Today we have sharp edges, like we have our corners of our buildings are all sharp. We don't have any buildings that are rounded, but they had all the corners of their houses were rounded. Now this thing was because they didn't have huge towering mansions. They had only small houses, and maximum they had a building, a house which was ground and with one floor above. That's it. They didn't go higher than one floor. And so each corner of each house which was leading onto the road was rounded off. This was rounded to allow carts to pass easily. The fourth point was that houses had drainage system. They were very particular about cleanliness, and the drainage system was their main criteria. Now this criteria, they had it well planned. They had closed drains all along the city roads. There were closed drains all along the city roads. These drains led out of the citadel, led out into the town planning, into the homes down below, and from the citadel to the towns down below, and from the towns down below, the same drain led out far into the open, so that people were not people would not get sick or procure any kind of disease. So they were very particular. They had closed drains. If you go to certain pockets in Maharashtra, certain areas in Maharashtra, even today, we have drains that are leading out. You can take, if you go to Ratnagiri, and if you go to a place, if you go to Chiprun, in Chiprun, which is a city, which is the main city of Ratnagiri, you will see that they all have drains outside. Along the road, they have drains that are running. So these drains run from the water from each house runs into the main drain. These drains along Chiprun also are covered with stone, the same way like the Harappans did. So we have followed part of their tradition also is being followed till date. So this was something which was really developed a long time ago. Now this houses, each house had an individual draining system. The bath water, the kitchen water, it would all drain into the main drain in front of their houses, and that main drain would carry it out away from the city. The streets of the house, that was the fifth point I am coming to. The streets crossed the main road at right angles. Every street crossed the main road. They had one main road. So you have main roads that led into the town, and you have by lanes. You have by lanes that were gridded all along. So these by lanes, they connected, all these by lanes connected to the main road, and they were all connected at right angles. So here you know that they were good in geometry. This divided the city square. Doing it in right angles divided the city square into rectangular blocks. So turning out the way they made the roads at right angles, so each four right angles made it into one great big rectangular block. So each city had blocks. So people were living in different blocks in different areas. Now we come, as I told you earlier on, we come to the next part, which is houses. Houses also has been a very prime and more important thing. Each house was built on a plinth because it was because of floods. They were scared of the waters flooding. In those days, we didn't have any, what we are facing now, global warming and all that. It was pure good nature. So the floods used to come, and they used to be rampant floods. So each house was built on a platform, and that was to save them from the flood waters. The main characteristics was, the first one is that the residential buildings were built according to a set plan. So the people at the citadel, they had a set plan. All residential buildings had to be built according to the set plan. This was built on a high mound in order to protect them from the floods, and their foundation was very, very deep. And they did not want, being an urban city, they did not want to lose their beauty. So they didn't want anybody to just build any kind of home anywhere. So they had to follow the rules of the people from the citadel, from the higher structure at the citadel. They had to follow those rules, and then only they could build. If they went against the rules, they were not allowed to build. There were variations in the sizes of homes. Now, this is another very, this is a thing that tells us that it gives us a distinction, a class distinction. It tells us that they had a distinction among the classes. Now, this class distinction tells us that the higher class people had bigger homes, the lower class people had little smaller homes. Now, these homes, they all had houses of various sizes, but from single rooms to tenements, and they had to bigger houses. The bigger houses had courtyards. So, you enter in and then there were rooms, and in the center they had a courtyard, like today present day what we call Vada. In Marathi we call it Vada. So, it is based on that. The bigger houses had rooms all around, and it was centralized with a courtyard in the middle. Now, this courtyards used to be a place where they would sit and they would do their work, or they would meet and they would talk, and they would have recreation for people. So, houses with courtyards were built up to 12 rooms. So, this tells us the distinction among the upper class of the people. So, when the houses were built with 12 rooms, so that belonged to you and had a courtyard, you knew that it was someone who was very famous around. So, people knew where they were going. These 12 rooms also had private toilets. Can you believe it? They had private wells and private toilets. In those day and age, they had toilets, and they did not go and defecate in the open. Like today, we have people in our villages who are still defecating in the open. But in those days, imagine they had toilets where they did not defecate at all in the open. So, they had, and the private homes had wells. But those homes that did not have wells, they had common wells where the other people could use the water from those common wells. And the drains, they were connected to the street drains. Each entrance of the house was made from a narrow lane. So, no house had an entrance facing the main street. None of the houses had their entrances that faced the main street. The main street was totally blank, and it had only walls of the houses. Every house, however big or however small, had its entrance from the lanes. They had to enter into a lane to enter into the main door of a house. So, these entrances were from narrow lanes which cut the street at right angles. The kitchen was placed in a sheltered corner of the courtyard. So, all kitchens were placed in a sheltered corner of the courtyard on the ground floor, and the corner of the courtyard, along with the kitchen, it also had a storeroom and not on the main road. So, the kitchen, the courtyard did not face the main road. It never opened out to the main road. Nothing opened out to the main road. It all opened into the narrow lane. Even the courtyard, the kitchen, the storeroom, other rooms, everything, they all opened up into the narrow lanes. The houses, they were made meticulously. The houses were made meticulously, and they were made out of brick, wood, and each house had doors and windows. So, you can imagine at that point of time, they were very particular about the cross ventilation. They believed in the sun god. They wanted the sun to pour in, and so they had windows facing north, south, east, west, according to each one's liking. So, they had these windows, and they also had ventilators. Can you believe it? At that day and age, they had ventilators in the upper floors of the homes. They had ventilators on top to get in more air and more sunlight. Doors and windows were opened on the side of the streets and not on the main roads. We have monumental architecture. Now, the next part that I am going to deal with is monumental architecture. Monumental architecture is nothing but we call it monumental architecture because it is telling us more about the monuments in the past. It tells us more about the monuments that were there in the past. So, it is giving us an architectural idea and the design and what it evidently led to and what the public buildings were all about. So, we take the Great Bath. So, we come back again to the Great Bath. there is a lot of importance. You may feel that why am I repeating the same thing? Yeah, repetition is because it is of great it's a great monument and it has great value. So, for this great bath, we had a chapter which was ahead before this. So, you can continue to the same chapter. If you go back to your page, you go back to page number 6. You follow the same thing of page number 6 in that chapter, and you will get your great details of the great bath. Next, we move on to the granaries. The granaries have been found at several sites like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Lothal, Kalibanga. However, at Harappa, there were 2 rows of 6 granaries, each to the south of the granaries at Harappa, and they were working from the floors, and these consisted in rows of circular brick platforms. They had circular brick platforms. Now, the circle that had the circular brick platform, it had crevices, and in those crevices they found barley and they found oats and they found wheat. So, this tells us that that was probably used as a threshing pad. It was a piece of land that was used for threshing the crop. So, this it is believed that these floors were meant for threshing grain, because wheat and barley grains were found in the crevices of the floors. The room, there were 2 roomed barracks. They had, each row had 2 rooms which were barracks, and these barracks were possibly to accommodate the labourers who were working over there and who looked after the granary. So, the rooms were probably accommodation for the labourers who were working, and also that's what the archaeological people think, that probably it could be for the labourers, or it probably could be for storing the grains. It could be for the grains were brought to this place by boat. So, probably they carried the grains to that particular place and they stored it and they brought it by boat. It was built on a raised platform to protect it from floods. So, that was the granary, and the rooms, they had ventilation on top. This ventilation prevented them from becoming mildewed because they were close to the river, close to the and there was a lot of humidity. So, humidity would lead to the grains getting mildewed. So, they had to have a lot of air which circulated among the in the granary, so that the grains did not catch mildew. So, you can imagine that how they were technologically, they knew what they wanted, and they had a good idea about the environment also. Trade is the next one. This is a very crucial part, because they traded with other people and they had a lot of import and export going on among themselves. First they had the barter system, then later on when the Mesopotamians and the Sumerians came in and they found that they had seal and they found copper. Earlier on I told you they found copper, so they started making seals. The seals also they made earlier on also I had mentioned that the seals were made out of terracotta, because they knew how to bake bricks. So, they used clay and they converted the clay into terracotta. They found different kinds of clay, different kinds of silt, some which were porous, some which were not so porous, and they used it and they made terracotta. So, they had seals. They started copying the Sumerians and the Mesopotamians, and they developed their own seals, and this elaborate social structure and standard of living confirmed the presence of granaries. Now, these granaries were and numerous seals. They had granaries, numerous seals. There was a uniform script on each seal. Every seal had a uniform script. The script indicated the existence of a highly developed system of trade. So, they tells us that the trade at that time was very, very highly developed. So, now you see this part of it, I shall end over here and I will continue with trade, because it is a little bit vast. The Harappans carried out trade, enormous trade, and what goods they traded with and who they traded with, I will do it in our next session. So, I shall end now. So, you please read what I have said and you can continue and read the lesson from the very beginning and follow, read it very carefully, because each and every sentence has a meaning, and you could be asked a single line question. So, I shall end this session now.